Thank you for the chance to be here for this amazing event. I'm thrilled that this is the topic that we have for today, and it's an area that has been of great interest to me as well. So let me just start here. So I currently I'm not an expert on the South African Constitution, but I have studied intensively the history of apartheid in South Africa in the context of a book that I'm writing on the Nobel Peace Prize. And there's two specific chapters in that book that I just finished this past summer that deal with South Africa. One is a chapter juxtaposing the U.S. Civil Rights Movement in the early 60s and the push for the end to the apartheid in the early 60s at the exact same time. And as we're coming out of a period of discrimination and oppression, South Africa is going into a period of great darkness, with Mandela being imprisoned at the same exact time that we are passing the Civil Rights Act. So there's a chapter on that. Then there's another chapter that focuses on the sort of dawn of new democracies at the end of the Cold War. And in that period, South Africa is the great hope, right? After the Cold War ended, after the progress in Eastern Europe, in 89, 90, 91, South Africa is the next great example of progress toward democracy. And so I want to read for you a few excerpts from this book that is not yet published, about the story, the narrative history of the story of South Africa from February 10th, 1990, which was the day that Nelson Mandela was released from prison, until May 11th, 1994, when Nelson Mandela was elected as the first democratic president of the Republic of South Africa. So I want to briefly, because many of you in the room that are from South Africa know this history very, very well, but all of the students were toddlers at the time, and so probably don't know or appreciate the full just drama of the history of South Africa that happened during this 4-year period. So this is written not as a legal piece, but as a sort of narrative history to try to get a feel for the experience, even though it is all about the creation of the Constitution and the democracy of South Africa. So let me just read for you these things, which I hope you'll find illuminating, and then I'll conclude with a few comments about the Constitution. The drive from Paarl to Cape Town was only 45 minutes. The plan was for Nelson Mandela to address the world at the Grand Parade, the great public square adjacent to the Fort of Good Hope, where South Africa's founding father, Jan van Riebeeck, had established a toehold for the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. As Mandela drew near to the Grand Parade, an enormous crowd enveloped his car. A massive hailstorm of joyous fists hammered down on the boot and the bonnet. Well-wishers jumped on the car in celebration, and it began to shake violently. I felt as though the crowd might very well kill us with their love, Mandela recalled. Attempts to clear the path were futile, and Mandela sat there, stranded in his vehicle, for hours. After over 10,000 days of imprisonment, Mandela was now imprisoned by tens of thousands of his most ardent supporters. Parade marshals eventually came to the rescue, and Mandela finally reached his destination several hours late. Standing on the balcony of the City Hall, overlooking the Grand Parade, he looked down on a boundless sea of people cheering, holding flags and banners, and clapping and laughing. He began his speech in his native Xhosa tongue, leading the massive crowd in the responsive chant that was a regular feature of anti-apartheid gatherings. Power, Mandela bellowed with his fist raised. It is ours, replied the cheering crowd. Power, Mandela repeated. It is ours, yelled the throngs. Africa, chanted Mandela. Let it come back, they chanted back. Let it come back, Mandela replied. Africa, they answered in a crescendo that was decades in the making. As the crowd settled down, Mandela embarked on a militant speech that embraced the battle against apartheid on all fronts. Our struggle has reached a decisive moment, Mandela said. We call on our people to seize this moment so that the process toward democracy is rapid and uninterrupted. We have waited too long for our freedom. We can no longer wait. Saluting communists and combatants, embracing international sanctions, and vowing to continue the armed struggle against apartheid, Mandela catered to his swelling ranks and flamed the fears of his nervous opponents. After 27 years of internal exile, Mandela knew that the first step toward peace was to restore his leadership within the African National Congress. White South Africans were shocked by Mandela's fiery speech. The day before, President F.W. de Klerk had assured them that Nelson Mandela was committed to a peaceful solution and a peaceful progress. After hearing the speech, de Klerk felt deceived. I realized once again that the road ahead would be extremely difficult. The great question that vexed South Africa for decades was not if, but when. When would the dawn come? The sun-tipped mountains shone bright, but the great valleys, the valleys where old men and women scratched the red blood soil to survive, remained in darkness. When, in the words of Cry the Beloved Country, would that dawn come of our emancipation? Emancipation from fear of bondage and the bondage of fear. The answer did not come on February 11th, 1990, the day of Mandela's release. Nothing Mandela said that day assuaged white fears or emancipated black bondage. At most, one could glimpse the first lights of the new dawn on the tips of the mountain. President F.W. de Klerk, the one responsible for Mandela's freedom, was sanguine. I was struck by an inescapable truth. An irreversible process had begun, and nobody could predict precisely how it would end. By 1993, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were on the brink of a successful political compromise. Such a compromise posed an existential threat to white extremists who feared the worst if whites lost power. On Easter Saturday, April 10th, 1993, Christopher Hani, the second most popular black politician in South Africa, pulled into the driveway of his home in the racially mixed neighborhood of Boksburg, just east of Johannesburg. While exiting his car, a white extremist named Janus Walus walked up to Hani and shot him 4 times in the face, chest, killing him instantly. The assassin then calmly returned to his car and drove away. Hani's neighbor, a white Afrikaner woman, heard the shots and managed to scribble down Walus' license plate number. She immediately called the police, and within minutes, Walus, a member of the right-wing Afrikaner resistance movement, was under arrest. Further arrests followed, including Clive Derby-Lewis, a former Conservative Party member of the South African Parliament. A search of the assassin's home uncovered a hit list of anti-apartheid leaders who were targeted for assassination. The name of Nelson Mandela was at the top of the list. In the wake of Hani's assassination, F.W. de Klerk called Nelson Mandela and urged him to address the nation. This was Mandela's moment, de Klerk recalled. Only he would be able to calm this enraged followers. Mandela rose to the occasion with a call for restraint that confirmed his presidential medal. This is a watershed moment for all of us. Our decisions and actions will determine whether we use our pain, our grief, and our outrage to move forward to what is the only lasting solution for our country: an elected government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The assassinations and arrests sparked fears that a right-wing conspiracy would derail the fragile democracy talks. white extremists plotted further attacks on black townships. Black South Africans were looting and burning townships, and the leftist Pan-African Congress was calling for armed resistance. The left and the right were preparing for war as de Klerk and Mandela occupied the center and pleaded for peace. They both agreed that pushing for accelerated negotiations on an interim constitution was the best hope for pulling their country back from the brink. Since Mandela's release in February 1990, negotiations between the ANC and the National Party had been a series of protracted stalemates punctuated by concessions. In December 1991, the Convention for the Democratic South Africa, CODESA 1, ended with little progress and acrimonious accusations. De Klerk demanded that the ANC honor its promise to end the armed struggle, while Mandela accused de Klerk of heading an illegitimate, discredited minority regime that failed to uphold basic moral standards. It was an inauspicious start. A second convention, CODESA 2, held in May 1992, ended in stalemate after de Klerk and Mandela divided over supermajority voting and minority safeguards. De Klerk viewed such measures as legitimate checks and balances against the tyranny of the majority. Mandela viewed them as desperate attempts to maintain white minority control. The essence of the problem is not one of percentages or arithmetic, Mandela said. It is that the National Party is trying to hold on to power at all costs. An ideological chasm divided the delegates. Sporadic violence and mass demonstration ruptured the negotiations through much of 1992. Many black South Africans were convinced that they should pursue the Leipzig option of mass demonstrations that would precipitate the sudden collapse of the government, just as mass demonstrations had with communist governments in Europe. Although it infuriated de Klerk, Mandela employed a variation on this strategy, using mass demonstration as a tool to strengthen his negotiation hand. By the end of September 1992, the two leaders reached a series of concessions, with the National Party promising a constitutional assembly and a transitional government, and the ANC promising sunset clauses that safeguarded white civil servant jobs during the transition period. All that was left to negotiate was a date for the election of the assembly and the percentage of majorities necessary for it to reach its decision, Mandela recalled. By April 1993, the delegates had made substantial progress toward an interim constitution. But the violence and looting in the wake of Chris Hani's assassination threatened to disrupt the negotiations and push the country to the brink of civil war. Mandela channeled the country's fears and anger in a productive direction, and de Klerk recognized the moment as an opportune one for historic concessions. De Klerk considered the far right boorish and repulsive, and seized the opportunity to use the violent neo-fascist tactics against them. The accelerated pace of negotiations led to a June 3, 1993 decision to hold national elections on April 27, 1994. The right-wing white extremists and left-wing black militants both walked out in protest. Zulu chief Buthelezi threatened to boycott the elections and create a separate Zulu state. But it was too late. For the first time in South African history, the black majority would go to the polls to elect their own leaders. The end of over 3 centuries of white rule was now in sight. With an election click talking, the constitutional negotiations had a renewed sense of urgency. Finally, in November 1993, the delegates approved an interim constitution reflecting a compromise that safeguarded minority interests but transferred power to the 85% majority black South Africans. A federal state with 9 provinces was a concession to minority whites and former black homelands. The 400-member National Assembly and 90-member Senate would be elected by proportional representation through universal adult suffrage. Separation of powers a Bill of Rights, and an independent judiciary would limit executive power. Power sharing among a multi-party cabinet of a unity government would be reached by consensus. Negotiations on the final constitution would require approval by a constitutional court and a 2/3 Constitutional Assembly vote. On December 22nd, 1993, the South African Parliament adopted the interim constitution by a vote of 237 to 45, ending apartheid forever and paving the way for a democratic South Africa. De Klerk called it a constitution which once and for all will rid this country of the albatross which we have had around our necks for 300 years. A racist, authoritarian police state was reborn as a multiracial, modern, liberal democracy. All that remained was to elect Nelson Mandela as the country's president. Today is a day like no other before it, declared Nelson Mandela on the day of national elections. Voting in our first free and fair elections has begun, and today marks the dawn of our freedom. Blacks and whites stood shoulder to shoulder in line, waiting for hours in the first democratic vote in South African history. We've been waiting for 5 hours, said one young black voter, but other people have been waiting for 40 years. In rural areas, voters walked for miles in their finest clothes to the nearest polling station. Celebrations filled the air as millions went to polls with a mixture of pride and dignity. After casting the first vote of his life, Archbishop Desmond Tutu danced a jig and proclaimed, "It's an incredible day for all our people. I mean all our people, black and white." It was as though every South African was liberated with each ballot cast. In April 1994, the curse was lifted. A nation was reborn. Although the outcome was never in doubt, both de Klerk and Mandela were satisfied with the results. The ANC garnered 62.6% of the vote, while the National Party won 20.6%. It was enough to guarantee that the 2/3 majority required for the drafting of the Constitution would require the input of all major parties. Mandela expressed relief that the ANC fell short of the supermajority mark. Had we won 2/3 of the vote and been able to write a constitution unfettered by input from others, people would argue that we had created an ANC constitution and not a South African one. May 10 dawned bright and clear, recalled Nelson Mandela. A sea of over 50,000 South Africans of every race descended on Pretoria to watch Nelson Mandela take the oath of office. Black South Africans waved the new South African flag and danced the Tory Tory. A jubilant Archbishop Desmond Tutu was delirious with joy. It's a transfiguration. We are free. We are free. Millions of white South Africans greeted the day with a mix of trepidation and hope. It was a day that many white South Africans had dreaded for centuries, recalled F.W. de Klerk, but the moment for which I had worked day and night since I became president of South Africa. With 1 billion viewers watching the largest gathering of dignitaries in South African history, Nelson Mandela was sworn in as the first black president. His inaugural speech was both conciliatory and commanding. The time for healing of wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us. We shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. Never, never, never again shall it be that the beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. For decades, generations of South Africans had dreamed of this moment, the moment of emancipation from the fear of bondage and the bondage of fear. The dawn of a new South Africa had finally come. The Constitutional Court was established in 1994 by the interim Constitution. The court, the key institution of constitutional democracy, continues to function under the final Constitution of 1996. The 1993 Constitution ushered in a legal order based on the concept of constitutional supremacy over against the old regime of parliamentary supremacy. From April 27, 1994, the interim constitution became the law's touchstone until its final constitution was enacted in 1996. An 11-person court was established and became the highest legal authority in the land on all constitutional matters. The court was finally opened by President Nelson Mandela on February 14, 1995. Mandela told the court, "The last time I appeared in court was to hear whether or not I was going to be sentenced to death. Fortunately for myself and my colleagues, we were not. Today I rise, not as an accused, but on behalf of the people of South Africa, to inaugurate a court South Africa has never had, a court on which hinges the future of our democracy."